The whole of the Gurdjieff tradition is infused with the idea that we are asleep and that we need to wake up. Typically, people don't really understand what these terms mean, and you can read many books and still not be particularly well informed on what those terms mean. And in fact, it's a fairly natural thing for us to fall into imagination about what those things mean. So let's try and add some meat, some reason to the situation so that we can understand what's being talked about. Now, when we're asleep in bed and dreaming, we're in our own completely subjective world. There's nothing in there that, or very little in there, that relates to reality. And those dreams can be pleasant or they can be nightmares, and if the nightmare gets bad enough, then we tend to wake up into our normal state. So that's the bottom rung, if you like, on the ladder. And then in the tradition, the Gurdjieff tradition, people talk about our waking sleep. So our normal state of consciousness. What is meant by this is essentially imagination. And as the word implies, imagination is concerned with images. Images that we create in our minds, daydreams, all kinds of things that we unconsciously do throughout the day. We get lost in our imagination. And imagination doesn't just consist of images. There's also a continual chattering that goes on in the mind, little conversations that we have with ourselves. And these conversations can be interesting, they can be awful, they can be just pure flights of fancy. They can be conversations that we've had in the past that we chew over and over and over again in our minds, or imagined conversations that we're going to have in the future. Now, there's nothing wrong with the imagination, as long as we know that we're in imagination. So what's the alternative to being in imagination? Well, the alternative is being in reality and being aware of your own body, of how you are feeling, of the thoughts that are going on in your mind, of the reality outside of you, what you can see, the colours, smells, sounds. You know, it's fairly endless. Of course, we can't, or typically we don't, live in reality. We live in our imaginations, probably 99.9% of the day. Now, you may say, why would someone want to wake up from that? Well, if what was in our imaginations was wholly pleasant, we might be tempted to stay there. But in reality, what sits in our imaginations is very often painful. And I include memory within imaginations. Memory is essentially a stored bank of images and associations that the imagination can call upon. And the problem is that our imagination and our memory are conditioned. So let's say a child is conditioned by its parents that whenever the child visits someone or goes out with friends or whatever, the child has to look absolutely immaculate. Immaculately dressed, immaculately groomed, immaculate manners, so on and so forth. Total overtraining. Well, that child is going to grow up into an adult who believes that They are only acceptable to other people if they put on a good show, effectively. There are plenty of people like this. And the other side of this particular coin is that the person is always afraid that they are not giving the right impression, because this is how they've been programmed, that they are not acceptable and they are not adequate. There are lots of these conditionings we get as children. They're almost endless. And so we grow up living in our own programmed world, full of images and ideas and little conversations that we have with ourselves that are our own little hell. There are some pleasant things in there, of course. We recall pleasant times and so on. But actually, we're locked into a world that is static. Gurdjieff famously said that most people are dead by the time they're 30. It's a fairly harsh thing to say, but what he was saying was that they are fully programmed, and that is what they will be for the rest of their lives. And depending on the programming, they will either be moderately happy maybe, or possibly very unhappy. Now, there's a lot of talk in the Gurdjieff work of waking up. It makes it sound like it's something you have to do. And to interpret waking up as something we have to do, some effort we have to make, is a terrible travesty, because it's not like that at all. Waking up comes when we stop doing. There's always some kind of paradox involved in the truth. And so you might immediately think, well, stopping doing is doing. Well, no, it isn't. What waking up requires is that we simply observe what's going on in our lives, how we feel. It's a useful thing at any time to ask yourself, how am I feeling right now? And just to feel it. You might be a little bit anxious. You might be a little bit sad. You might be feeling some kind of anticipation for some future event. Whatever it is, you just feel it. You don't try and change it. You don't criticize it. You don't judge it. You just look at it. And observation, as you probably read within In Search of the Miraculous, Spencer gives a very good example of throwing consciousness upon things is like switching the lights on, seeing what's there. And many of the more unpleasant things that reside within us cannot live in that environment of light. So we look. We don't try and change. We do not do. Doing is what has caused us unhappiness. Ceasing to do is what will liberate us from it. If we try to do, if we try to change things, we just make the labyrinth deeper, more complex, more difficult to get out of. Because our imagination and memory is like a huge labyrinth, and we crawl around in it. And when we think in terms of words, and when we imagine in terms of pictures. And these things are just literally adding to the collection of memories and images and ideas that we already have, and not allowing us to be free. So the stopping doing is actually all we need to do. It's not really a doing. The stopping doing happens on its own. All you have to do is observe. I say all you have to do. It takes a long time to get to the point where you can just look at how you are feeling and what you are thinking and just say, oh yeah, that's going on. And just take note. So I've been involved with a number of groups, some of them fairly close to the origin of all of this, close to Gurdjieff. And you find all kinds of strange behavior. And these things are not readily understood by many people. I think Uspensky did say somewhere that ultimately the act of enlightenment, if we dare use that word, is simply a letting go. And of course our ego is like a clenched fist. It's like a monkey with its clenched fist in the goodie jar. Just can't get its fist out unless it lets go of the goodies. And it will not let go of the goodies. And in fact, the more the ego tries to get free, the more it is pulling against the neck of the jar with its handful of goodies. It cannot let go of the goodies because the goodies are what it is. So, in effect, you don't need to do anything to wake up. You need to be. And you need to be before you can observe. So you need to be a little bit separate from what you're observing. There needs to be a little bit of space. And that space will only come about through practice. Now, you need to have effectively an internal barometer for this kind of practice. If you find that you're getting effectively more uptight, a little bit more anxious, if your self-observation is bringing about those results, then you're not observing correctly. Observation should be associated with a sense of, however small, but a sense of liberation, of seeing something that you didn't see before. All we have to do is dig down into the trash can and look what is there. We don't need to empty the trash can, it cannot be emptied. And we don't need to live in the trash can. If we're observing it, then we're not living in it. And all of us has a trash can inside of us. And the aim of this work to some extent is not to live in the trash can, and in fact to use the trash can as energy for growth. And then we get into another word. Well, what does growth mean? Well, what you are is not something that you understand. Normally, when people talk about growth, they talk about things like learning in life and acquiring, effectively. There's the idea of acquiring experience or acquiring knowledge or acquiring. Growth, real spiritual growth, for want of a better word, is or comes about through a letting go. Through letting go of all the things that we think we know, letting go of our prejudices, letting go of our anxieties, letting go of the things that we hold dear. I mean, Gurdjieff said that all we are asked to sacrifice is our suffering, and yet we hang on to it for dear life. And we do hang on to it. And we don't know why we hang on to it, but the weapon we have is observing. So, to summarize this particular video, don't buy into the notion that waking up is some heroic act of attention or some kind of effort, some kind of doing. It isn't. It's the opposite of that. It's an inner relaxation and a simple observation of what is happening. I tend to call it the pain radar. We should have a pain radar operating within us that we use every now and then. We just effectively do a scan. How am I feeling? Oh, feeling a bit anxious. Oh, yeah, feeling a bit sad. Or, I'm feeling okay, whatever happens to be the case. And this is the way we need to do this work. I've seen the results of people believing that they need to do something intense and effectively violent to themselves. Please don't do that, and don't let anyone convince you that that is the way to do this work. It is not. It's a very gentle, and it's a very what's the word? Well, it's non-violent. There's no violence involved. That could bring me onto topics like self-discipline. The wrong kind of self-discipline is literally one part of yourself bullying another. But, hey, we could go on forever. So self-discipline might be topic of another video. Hopefully that's been useful.